I'm David Schlossberg. I'm a professor of environmental politics here at the University of Sydney, and I'm also the co-director of the Sydney Environment Institute. This is an event that we put together on governing adaptation. It's a co-production of the Sydney Environment Institute, the Australian Centre for Environmental and Climate Law, and the Sydney Network on Climate Change and Society. And the idea behind today is to look at not just climate change and not really just adaptation to climate change, but about how we govern that adaptation. What are the processes that are used? How do we engage the public? What sorts of ways do we understand vulnerability and inclusion? So we've brought in a range of speakers from around the globe, from the US, from the UK, from Australia, from Thailand, to talk about a range of issues having to do with governing adaptation. And the first session really was there to set the stage, both the sort of the big picture from the top down and also what some of the discussion is just around how we begin to govern adaptation. So John Barnett gave a talk that focused in one way on a small community in Australia around Lakes Entrance, and the difference between this sort of broad top-down approach to thinking about climate change from the top versus the understanding, the experience, and the knowledge of local communities.
And they see that the biggest conduit or the biggest implication of climate change was a planning decision that affected social problems for them. Nothing to do with changing the environment, everything to do with the way institutions have responded to the possibility of a changing environment.
And then we had Frank Tamala from the Stockholm Environment Institute, actually based in Bangkok, talk about the way that governments at the international level are starting to think specifically about disaster response and disaster management, but again, taking that sort of very top-level view at the international level. So we've had a little bit of the international, we've had a little bit of the global scientific, and a little bit of the local to kick off an understanding of the very different ways that we can frame the knowledge that goes into governing adaptation. So the second session was more specifically about justice in adaptation planning. And there we had a range of speakers addressing the sort of moral framework around adaptation planning and specifically conceptions of justice that are applicable in adaptation planning. So we started with Neil Adger and his discussion of the very different ways that different populations frame their understanding of climate change and the way that these different knowledges can be brought to bear.
The policy solutions that emerge around adaptation, if they are to gain public support, need to resonate with the moral way that people and the moral reasoning that people undertake whenever they are acquiescing, giving support, voting for, and engaging in adaptation.
Brina Holland followed with a very specific idea of how we might bring procedural justice to bear in adaptation planning. And there again, it's about the inclusion of local knowledge and local voice, but empowering local people and making them feel genuinely, as opposed to not so genuinely heard and included in conversations. At the global level, we had two speakers talk about conceptions of global justice. Robin Eckersley talking about the increasing responsibility that states will have to climate migrants, how we pay for migration from one country or another, and who takes responsibility for that.
I'm not for a minute suggesting the politics of this is going to be easy, but I think it's a very opportune time to be starting the debate.
And then we had Rosemary Lister talking specifically about damage due to climate change and ideas about how we might bring some sort of compensation and ways of constructing just forms of compensation for damage.
Post-disaster payments are only for losses that are uninsured. They are only for economic losses. They are meager, and they are almost never budgeted for in advance.
So the third session got at very different ways that governments approach adaptation planning and governing adaptation. So we had a discussion of the way that planning has to change from sort of a linear planning process to a more circular planning process as climate change continues to impact us in very different ways as time goes on. And then we brought it back down to the local level again to have a discussion specifically of adaptation planning in the City of Sydney.
Discussion and respect for people's local knowledge is what makes these conversations really vital for adaptation planning.
And then the final session today invited practitioners from across the region, from the City of Sydney, from the Sydney Coastal Councils, and from the State Environment and Heritage Office. So again, one of the ideas here is to get a conversation going, not only across the different academic spheres, and we do have academics from a number of different universities and disciplines here, but also to get this conversation going between the academics and the practitioners. Adaptation is going to be something that all governments are going to have to engage. How we design the governance of adaptation is a key question for the next few decades, and the Sydney Environment Institute wants to play a key role, especially in Australia, in how we develop relationships with the public, with other academics, and with those responsible for the governance of adaptation.